The morning fog clung to the Carpathian mountains like a burial shroud as Lieutenant Jozef Moravec crouched behind the shattered remains of a stone wall and checked his ammunition for the third time in as many minutes. 7 rounds left in his pistol magazine. 7 bullets between him and whatever fate the Germans had planned for this god-forsaken hilltop in eastern Slovakia. He looked at the crucifix his mother had pressed into his hand when he left Prague 4 years ago. The silver tarnished now and bent from the time it had deflected a piece of shrapnel that should have killed him outside Sevastopol. 7 bullets and a prayer. It would have to be enough. It was October 1944, and the Slovak national uprising that had begun with such hope in August was dying in these mountains. Lieutenant Moravec commanded what remained of the 3rd Company, 2nd Battalion of the 1st Czechoslovak Partisan Brigade, a grandiose title for the 23 exhausted, hungry and terrified men who occupied the ruins of an old Austrian fort on Hill 487. They had been ordered to hold this position for 24 hours while the main partisan force retreated to new positions in the Tatra Mountains. That had been 3 days ago, and there had been no word from command since the radio operator took a bullet through the throat during the first German assault. Moravec was 31 years old, a former schoolteacher from a small town near Bratislava who had never imagined he would end his life on a hilltop surrounded by enemies. Before the war, his greatest concerns had been lesson plans and whether Anna Havlichkova, the young music teacher, would accept his invitation to dinner. He had been awkward around women, passionate about history and literature, and had harboured quiet dreams of writing a book about Slovak folk tales someday. The war had transformed him into something else entirely, a killer, a survivor, a man who could look at a 17-year-old boy with half his face blown away and feel nothing but irritation that the screaming was giving away their position. "Sir." The voice belonged to Sergeant Kováč, a farmer from the lowlands who had been with Moravec since the beginning. Kováč was 42, built like a bear, with hands that could snap a man's neck, but were more comfortable holding a plough. He crawled up beside Moravec, his face streaked with dirt and dried blood from a scalp wound. "The Germans are forming up again. Looks like at least 2 companies this time, maybe more. They've got a half-track with an 88mm gun positioned on the eastern approach." Moravec nodded, processing this information with the detached efficiency that combat had beaten into him. An 80mm gun could reduce their stone fortifications to rubble in minutes. They had no anti-tank weapons, no heavy machine guns, nothing that could stop armour. They had rifles, a few submachine guns, some hand grenades, and the rapidly diminishing will to keep fighting a battle they had already lost. "Pull everyone back to the inner courtyard," Moravec ordered. "We'll make them come to us. Maybe the narrow passages will neutralize some of their advantage." Kováč didn't move immediately. "Sir, permission to speak freely?" "You're going to anyway." "We should surrender. We've done our duty. We held them for 3 days. The men are exhausted. We're almost out of ammunition, and there's no relief coming. Surrendering now isn't cowardice. It's common sense." Moravec looked at his sergeant, this decent man who had killed Germans with his bare hands when they threatened a village full of civilians, who had carried wounded men for kilometres through mountain passes, who deserved to go home to his farm and his wife and his 4 children. "The Germans aren't taking prisoners anymore, Tomáš. You know that. Not after what happened at Nemeka. They're shooting partisans on sight. Then we run, scatter into the mountains. Some of us might make it. And abandon our wounded? There are 6 men who can't walk, 2 who probably won't survive the day. We leave them here, and the Germans will execute them. Slowly." Kováč's jaw tightened. He knew Moravec was right, but that didn't make it easier to accept. "So we all die here instead?" "We die anyway," Moravec said quietly. "The question is whether we die like animals or like men who chose to stand for something. You don't have to stay, Tomáš. I'm ordering you to take any man who wants to go and try to make it through German lines. That's not desertion. That's following orders." The sergeant spat into the dirt. "With respect, sir, fuck your orders. If you're staying, I'm staying. But you should know that not all the men feel the same way." He jerked his head toward the far corner of the courtyard, where a group of 5 soldiers huddled together, their body language suggesting conspiracy. "Malik and his friends have been talking about surrendering with a white flag. They think the Germans will respect the Geneva Convention if we lay down arms properly." Moravec felt a cold anger rise in his chest. Private Jan Malik was 19 years old, had been with the unit for less than a month, and had proven himself a coward during every engagement. He complained constantly, shirked duty, and spread defeatism among the younger soldiers. Moravec had considered having him shot for insubordination twice, but had stayed his hand because the boy reminded him of one of his former students, earnest but weak, wanting to be brave but lacking the spine for it. "Keep an eye on them," Moravec said. "If they try to surrender, they'll get us all killed. The Germans will assume it's a trick and come in shooting." He moved through the ruins, checking on his men, offering words of encouragement that sounded hollow even to his own ears. Most of them were so young, barely old enough to shave. There was Private Lukáš Svoboda, 18 years old, who clutched a photograph of his girlfriend and whispered prayers to the Virgin Mary. There was Corporal Martin Horak, 22, a former university student who quoted Kafka and Havel and had written poetry about the nobility of their cause. There was Private Peter Balázs, the youngest at 17, who cried quietly when he thought no one was watching and kept asking when they could go home. And then there were the veterans, the hard men who had survived this long through a combination of skill, luck, and ruthlessness. Corporal Victor Novak, 35, who had fought in the Winter War in Finland and had a collection of German scalps that he kept in a tobacco tin. Private Stefan Ondrej, 29, a former policeman who could shoot the wings off a fly at 200 meters. Sergeant Pavel Žiak, 40, who had lost his entire family to the Hlinka Guard and fought with the cold fury of a man with nothing left to lose. These were the men who would hold the line when the final assault came. These were the men Moravec would die with. The German artillery opened up at 1000 hours. The 80mm gun on the half-track began systematically destroying what remained of the fort's outer walls, each shell impact sending showers of stone and dust into the air. Moravec's men huddled in whatever cover they could find, pressing themselves into corners and behind rubble, knowing that a direct hit would liquefy their bodies, but unable to do anything except wait and pray. Private Balázs broke first. The 17-year-old scrambled from his position and ran toward the rear of the fort, screaming incoherently. He made it perhaps 10 meters before a shell fragment took off the top of his head, dropping him like a puppet with cut strings. His body twitched for a few seconds and then lay still, steam rising from the open skull in the cold morning air. "Hold positions!" Moravec shouted over the bombardment. "Don't move unless I give the order!" The shelling lasted 20 minutes, an eternity of noise and terror and flying death. When it finally stopped, the sudden silence was almost worse. Moravec's ears rang, and he could taste blood and cordite. He blinked dust from his eyes and assessed the damage. 2 more men dead from shell fragments, 3 wounded, including Corporal Horak, who had a piece of stone the size of a fist embedded in his shoulder. The inner courtyard was choked with debris, and a section of the wall had collapsed completely. "Here they come," Novak shouted from his position overlooking the eastern approach. Moravec moved to the wall and looked down. German infantry were advancing in 2 waves, at least 60 men, moving with the practiced efficiency of veterans. They were from the 178th Reserve Division, middle-aged men mostly, recalled from civilian life to fight partisans in the mountains. not elite troops, but experienced and well-equipped. Behind them, the half-track crept forward, its gun traversing to cover the assault. "Hold your fire until I give the command," Moravec ordered. "Make every shot count." The Germans advanced methodically, using covering fire and movement tactics perfected on the Eastern Front. They were halfway up the slope when Moravec gave the order. "Fire!" The first volley tore into the leading German squad, dropping 5 men instantly. The others dove for cover, returning fire with disciplined bursts. The half-track's 80mm gun spoke again, the shell punching through the already weakened wall and exploding inside the courtyard. Moravec felt the concussion wave slam into him, driving the air from his lungs. When his vision cleared, he saw Corporal Horak lying in pieces, his poetry journal scattered among the bloody debris. The firefight intensified. Sergeant Kováč emptied his submachine gun magazine into a cluster of Germans trying to flank from the north, cutting down 3 before a return burst stitched across his chest. He fell backward, blood fountaining from his mouth, and died without making a sound. Private Svoboda stood to throw a grenade and took a bullet through the eye, the photograph of his girlfriend fluttering from his hand as he collapsed. "Fall back to the inner wall," Moravec shouted, firing his pistol at a German who had made it to the breach. 5 rounds left. 4, 3. Each shot a small prayer, each hit a minor miracle. The Germans kept coming, stepping over their own dead professional soldiers, doing their job with grim efficiency. Private Malik chose that moment to stand up with a white undershirt tied to a stick, waving it frantically above the parapet. "We surrender!" he screamed in German. "Don't shoot! We surrender!" The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The Germans, thinking it was a trick, poured concentrated fire into the position. Malik's head exploded in a pink mist, the white flag falling from his nerveless fingers. 2 of his friends who had been crouching nearby were cut down in the same burst. But worse, the surrender attempt had given away the defenders' positions. The Germans now knew exactly where everyone was. "God damn him!" Kováč snarled, firing methodically at the advancing infantry. "God damn that coward to hell!" Moravec had no time to respond. A German grenade landed 3 meters away, and he barely had time to turn his back before it detonated. Shrapnel tore into his left leg and back, pain exploding through his body like white fire. He fell, his pistol clattering away across the stone floor. 2 rounds left, and he couldn't reach it. Kováč was beside him instantly, dragging him behind cover with one massive arm while firing his rifle one-handed. "Stay down, sir. I've got you." "The gun!" Moravec gasped through gritted teeth. "Get my gun!" The sergeant stretched out, fingers reaching for the pistol lying in the open. A German bullet took off 2 of his fingers, and he jerked his hand back with a curse. "Can't reach it." The Germans were in the courtyard now, moving from cover to cover, methodically clearing the ruins. There were perhaps 8 defenders left, wounded and low on ammunition, fighting with the desperation of men who knew they were already dead. Corporal Novak emptied his last magazine, killed 2 more Germans, then drew a knife and charged screaming into a group of 3 soldiers. They shot him down, but not before he'd opened one German's throat with his blade. Private Andrei, the former policeman with the perfect aim, was out of rifle ammunition. He drew his pistol and began firing with mechanical precision. 1 shot, 1 kill, until the slide locked back on an empty chamber. He sat down calmly, crossed himself, and waited for death. It came seconds later. Only 4 men remained conscious: Moravec, Kováč, and 2 privates whose names Moravec couldn't remember through the haze of pain and shock. They were cornered in the deepest part of the ruins, surrounded by Germans who were taking their time now, knowing the fight was over. A German officer appeared in the breach, his uniform immaculate despite the morning's fighting. He was perhaps 50, with iron-grey hair and the cold eyes of a man who had seen too much war. He surveyed the carnage with professional detachment, then spoke in heavily accented Slovak. "You have fought well, but it is finished. Surrender now, and I give my word you will be treated according to the rules of war." Moravec knew it was a lie. He had heard the stories from villages the Germans had pacified. Partisans were shot on sight, their bodies left hanging as warnings. But the officer was giving them a chance to die with less pain, and that was something. "We have wounded," Moravec called back, his voice weak. "6 men who cannot walk. Will you care for them?" The officer nodded. "They will receive medical attention." Another lie, probably. But what choice did they have? Moravec looked at Kováč, at the sergeant's ruined hand, at the determination in his weathered face. "Tomáš, take the others and surrender. That's an order." "Sir." "An order, Sergeant. Someone needs to survive to tell what happened here, to remember their names." Kováč's face worked with emotion. Then he nodded slowly, helped Moravec into a sitting position against the wall, and stood with his hands raised. "We surrender," he called in German. "We are coming out." The remaining defenders emerged from cover, hands on their heads, moving slowly so the Germans wouldn't shoot them out of nervousness. Moravec watched them go, 3 men who would probably be dead by sunset, but maybe, just maybe, one of them would survive to bear witness. He was alone now in the ruins, bleeding and in agony, with his pistol still lying 3 meters away where he couldn't reach it. 7 bullets and a prayer. He had fired 5. 2 rounds left, if he could just get to the gun. The German officer approached, his boots crunching on broken stone. He looked down at Moravec with something that might have been respect. "You are the commander?" "Lieutenant Jozef Moravec, 3rd Company, 2nd Battalion, 1st Czechoslovak Partisan Brigade." "You held this position for 3 days against superior force. That took courage." The officer paused. "I am Hauptmann Werner Schröder, 178th Reserve Division. Before this war, I was a teacher in Hamburg, history and literature. I think perhaps we would have been friends, in another life." Moravec laughed, a wet, painful sound. "Perhaps. I must ask, why did you not surrender earlier? You could have saved the lives of your men. This was an unwinnable position." "Because some things are more important than winning," Moravec said. "Because we needed to prove to ourselves that we would stand and fight even when it was hopeless. Because those men deserved to die for something that mattered." Schröder nodded slowly. "I understand. I do not agree, but I understand." He drew his pistol. "I will make it quick. You have my word." "Wait." Moravec gestured toward the pistol lying on the ground. "May I hold my weapon? A soldier should die with his gun in his hand." The German officer studied him for a long moment, weighing the risk. Then he bent down, retrieved the pistol, and checked the magazine. 2 rounds. You could shoot me." "I could try, but we both know I'm too weak to raise it that high. I just want to die holding it." Schröder placed the pistol in Moravec's hand, then stepped back and raised his own weapon. "Do you wish to pray?" Moravec clutched the pistol, feeling its familiar weight, and closed his fingers around the crucifix in his other hand. 7 bullets and a prayer. He had fired 5 bullets. He held the prayer, and 2 rounds remained, one last decision to make. "I am praying," Moravec said, and then, with the last of his strength, he raised the pistol and fired both rounds, not at the German officer, but at the 80mm guns ammunition stores on the half-track he could just barely see through the breach. It was an impossible shot, made by a dying man with a shaking hand, across 30 meters of rubble and smoke. The first round went wide. The second, by some miracle or curse or divine intervention, struck true. The explosion was enormous, a rolling ball of orange fire that consumed the half-track and the dozen German soldiers standing near it. The concussion knocked Schroeder off his feet, and debris rained down across the courtyard. In the chaos, Moravec heard screaming, heard officers shouting orders, heard the general confusion of an unexpected disaster. Hauptmann Schroeder struggled to his feet, his face blackened with soot, his uniform torn. He looked at Moravec with something between horror and admiration. "You madman! You magnificent madman!" "7 bullets and a prayer," Moravec whispered. "I just saved the last 2 for something that mattered." The German officer raised his pistol again, but before he could fire, Moravec felt a strange peace wash over him. He thought of Anna Havlichkova, the music teacher, and wondered if she had survived the war. He thought of his students, their bright young faces bent over books about folk tales and heroes. He thought of his mother's crucifix, still clutched in his hand, and he understood finally that faith wasn't about believing you would be saved. It was about believing your death would mean something. "For Slovakia," Moravec said clearly. The shot, when it came, was almost a relief. The Slovak national uprising was crushed on October 27, 1944, when Banská Bystrica fell to German forces. More than 2,000 partisans died in the fighting. Thousands more were captured and sent to concentration camps. Over 100 villages were destroyed in retaliation. But the uprising proved that Slovakia would not go quietly into Nazi darkness, that there were men and women willing to stand against tyranny even when defeat was certain. Sergeant Kováč survived. He was sent to a labour camp in Germany, but lived to see liberation in April 1945. He returned to his farm, his wife, his 4 children, and he lived for another 43 years. Every year on the anniversary of the battle at Hill 487, he would climb into the mountains and place flowers on the cairn that marked where his brothers in arms had fallen. The story of Lieutenant Moravec's last stand became legend in the years after the war. Soviet historians claimed he was a communist hero. Czechoslovak authorities declared him a martyr for the state. But Kováč, who was there, who watched him die, told a different story to anyone who would listen. He wasn't fighting for communism or capitalism or any political cause, the old sergeant would say in his declining years, sitting in his farmhouse surrounded by grandchildren. He was fighting because when evil comes for you, you have 3 choices. You run, you submit, or you stand. Moravec chose to stand, not because he thought he would win, but because he believed that standing mattered more than winning. In 1969, the communist government of Czechoslovakia erected a monument on Hill 487. It was a typical socialist realist affair, all heroic poses and triumphant rhetoric, depicting Lieutenant Moravec as a fearless communist warrior leading his men against the fascist hordes. Kováč attended the dedication ceremony and said nothing, knowing that the truth was both simpler and more profound than any monument could capture. The real monument to Jozef Moravec wasn't stone or bronze. It was in the memories of the men who had fought beside him, in the villages that were saved by his 3-day defence, in the German casualties inflicted, in the ammunition that was destroyed, in the time that was bought for others to escape. It was in the example he set that ordinary men, schoolteachers and farmers and students could become extraordinary when history demanded it. In 1989, when the Velvet Revolution swept through Czechoslovakia and the communist government fell, one of the first acts of the new democratic leadership was to correct the historical record. The monument on Hill 487 was replaced with a simpler memorial, bearing the names of all 23 men who had died there, regardless of their political beliefs. At the centre was a bronze plaque with the inscription Moravec had carried throughout the war. 7 bullets and a prayer. Faith is not believing you will be saved. Faith is believing your sacrifice will matter. Sergeant Kováč, then 91 years old and confined to a wheelchair, was brought to the new memorial's dedication. When asked to speak, he rose with difficulty, supported by his great-grandchildren, and said simply, "They were brave men who died badly but well. Remember them. Remember what they stood for. And pray God you are never called upon to make their choice. But if you are, pray God you have their courage." He died 3 months later, in his sleep, in his farmhouse, surrounded by the family he had fought so hard to protect. His last words, whispered to his eldest daughter, were, "Tell them we held. For 3 days we held." The story of Hill 487 remains largely unknown outside of Slovakia. It was a small action in a small country during a rebellion that ultimately failed. But to those who study the war, who look beyond the grand battles and famous generals to find the moments where ordinary people made extraordinary choices, it stands as a reminder of what courage really means. Not the absence of fear, not the certainty of victory, but the willingness to stand when standing is all that's left, to fight when fighting is futile, to believe that the manner of your death can redeem the randomness of your life. 7 bullets and a prayer. Lieutenant Jozef Moravec fired all 7 bullets in defense of a cause he knew was already lost, and his prayer, that his death would matter, that his stand would be remembered, that his sacrifice would mean something to someone somewhere, was answered in ways he could never have imagined. In 2019, 75 years after the Slovak national uprising, historians discovered a letter in the German military archives. It was written by Hauptmann Werner Schröder to his wife, dated November 2, 1944, 1 week after the events at Hill 487. "My dearest Greta, I write to you from this miserable country with a heavy heart. Today I shot a man who reminded me too much of myself, a teacher turned soldier, fighting for his homeland against foreign invaders. He died bravely, more bravely than I have ever seen. In his last moments, rather than beg for mercy, he destroyed an armoured vehicle and killed 12 of my men. I should hate him for this. Instead, I find myself envious. He died believing his death mattered. I fear I will die believing mine does not. This war has made us all murderers, but some of us at least remain men. The partisan lieutenant was a man. May God forgive me for killing him, and may God grant me a death half as honourable as his." Werner Schröder survived the war. He returned to Hamburg, returned to teaching, and spent the rest of his life quietly educating German students about the dangers of nationalism and the cost of uncritical obedience. He never forgot the young Slovak lieutenant who had died in a ruined fort in the Carpathian mountains, and he never stopped wondering if, when his own moment came, he would find that same courage. The letter was donated to the Slovak National Uprising Memorial Museum in Banska Bystrica, where it remains on display alongside Moravec's crucifix, recovered from his body and eventually returned to his family. They rest side by side, the symbol of faith carried by a man who fought, and the confession of the man who killed him. 2 teachers, 2 soldiers, 2 men caught in a war neither wanted but both served. One remembered as a hero, the other as a villain. But, in the end, both men understood the same truth, that how we face our darkest moments defines us more completely than any ideology or uniform ever could. 7 bullets and a prayer. It's not much to face eternity with. But for Lieutenant Jozef Moravec and the 22 men who died with him on Hill 487, it was enough. They stood when they could have run. They fought when they could have surrendered. They died believing their sacrifice would matter. And 75 years later, in a free Slovakia that they did not live to see but helped create, their names are still spoken with reverence their story is still told to children learning what courage means. Their example still inspires those who face impossible choices. That is the only monument that matters. That is the only victory that endures. Not the ground held or lost, not the battles won or surrendered, but the memory of men who refused to be less than human when humanity itself was under siege. 7 bullets and a prayer. A last stand on a forgotten hilltop. 23 lives given for a cause that was already lost, and in the giving, everything was gained.